All right. Well, we're in James chapter 5 if you want to turn there. And yeah, it's an interesting section. It's the title of the message is "The High Price of Wealth," and it deals directly with the wealthy in a certain type of a wealthy person. And of course, you may be thinking, well, what are we doing here? But I'm going to do my best, certainly, to spread this application across the board. The Bible has certainly a lot to say about finances. And all of this is still in what we came to in chapter 4 as this big theme of James saying you can either love the world or you can love God. And of course, James gets all these ideas from Jesus himself, whom we'll quote from a few times. You can either love God or mammon, or the idea of money as well. There's a world system that's out there. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So that's talking about the people in the world. But there's a world system that's out there that's against God. John, in his one of his letters, makes reference to the spirit of Antichrist against Christ that's out there. It's we don't have to look far from our own shores here to see that in terms of discrimination against Christians, an eroding of our religious freedoms and so forth, all the way to the extreme of what's happened, of course, in northern Iraq and in Syria and so forth, Africa and other places. Those are the extremes, but it's a way of thinking. Again, Paul says in Romans 12, therefore, brethren, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. It's a world system, but be transformed from it by the renewing of your mind. Again, the G.B. Phillips translation says, don't allow the world to squeeze you into its mold. So this is the theme here from chapter 4 on. Sometimes we read James, and it seems like it's just a series of random thoughts as he's kind of putting them down. But we've tried to see that there is a continuing flow to many of these things. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, James says. Again, we can either be recipients of God's grace or we can have his opposition. We can buy into a materialistic way of looking at things and a materialistic way of living in this world, even as Christians, or we can reject it for the values that God gives us through his word. Just to read a couple of statistics that maybe help us. I thought this article was interesting. It was entitled "Americans Are Running Out of Room," and it was according to a trade show group, Self-Storage Association did a survey. They said they now possess 1.9 billion square feet of personal storage space outside the home. You may have seen a few of these facilities around. 40,000 facilities operated by 2,000 entrepreneurs. But according to a recent survey, 1 out of every 11 homes owns a self-storage facility or rents it and so forth. 1 out of 11. That's a 75% increase since 1995. The other thing that's interesting about this is that the average size home continues to get bigger, and the average size family continues to get smaller. So we've got less people living in bigger homes that still don't have enough room for their stuff. And so when we talk about the rich, sometimes we can relegate that to the Warren Buffetts of the world and so forth. But I would just remind us the fact that in terms of the standard of the world, all of us are rich. If you got food in your refrigerator, you got a roof over your head, you're better than most of the people in the world. They're hoping to earn enough today to have dinner tonight. And that's the way they live each and every day. So let's not relegate this passage for someone else. Again, it's a warning not about money itself, but a certain type of person who is rich. It's a radical warning, as you'll see. But again, James understands the nature of human tendency, if we're not rich, at least to envy the rich and think we'd be better off if we had more. And in fact, many of our, at least national elections, are won and lost if one particular party can get another group of people to what we call class envy. to envy other people. It's those rich guys, and we're against those rich guys, so we need to vote for these guys instead of those guys. So it's actually something that is populated in terms of, or made popular by politicization within our own elections. James, again, it's a terrifying description. Let's take a look at it. We're in chapter 5, verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and you will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He did not resist you. Quite an indictment. And I'm sensing maybe why Mia got so warm is that it would really help if we turned the air conditioning on. What do you think? And you might want to just see if these things are still turned on to fans or if they're really on AC. We had the carpets cleaned, and so when we do that, we run fans in here 24/7 until the carpets get all dried out. But a fan is not the same as air conditioning. I've detected. All right, back to our text. So point 1, the perilous times ahead for the rich. Come now, you who are rich. So again, the perilous times are not for all the rich. And one thing that has to be distinguished right away, is he talking to believers or to non-believers? And I think it's very clear by this railing indictment, this radical judgment that is coming against this group of people that they're not believers. If you look down to verse 7, you'll see the contrast. And we'll look at this next week. Therefore, be patient, brethren. Now he's talking back to believers again, until the coming of the Lord. Therefore, based on what he has said and what's going on, there could be a tendency to envy the rich. But he says, but I want to tell you guys who are believers, don't be like them, but rather have patience. The coming of the Lord is soon, and that'll be our subject next week. But just to point out, he's definitely talking to unbelievers. Again, there's nothing wrong with riches in and of themselves or wealth. Abraham was a wealthy man, walked with God, though. I think his possessions probably meant very little to him. Many men and women we see in the Bible that were quite wealthy. Lydia, who was the person who was the buyer and seller of garments and dyes and so forth in the book of Acts, very successful businesswoman, had some means and invites Paul and his entourage to stay in her home. You have Job, David, Josiah, Philemon, Joseph of Arimathea, all wealthy. The problem is not wealth in and of itself. Through the Gospels, and even through the law of Moses and the epistles, there's nothing there that would deride having wealth or the right of ownership and profit and so forth. In fact, if we follow the biblical guidelines within Scripture, we will find ourselves better off financially than not. So the Bible does condemn acquiring wealth by illegal means or for illegal purposes. And the prophet Amos railed against the people of his day because they were doing that. Isaiah and Jeremiah also covered a similar subject. And again, before I even get any further, just keep in mind who James is writing to. His church, Jerusalem. He's in a pretty major city. There's a lot of wealthy people there that have done well. You think of the Pharisees were all quite wealthy. You had the Ananias and his families that controlled everything on the Temple Mount, all the buying and selling and so forth, that Jesus railed against himself. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you can visit the former palace of Ananias, for example. So there was a lot of wealth in that city, in the city where this church is, where the letter is being written to. So that's important to keep in mind. Were some of them apparently coming to his congregation, listening to what Pastor James had to say to them? Apparently, because he's addressing them in this particular letter. Again, the problem isn't the wealth itself, it's the attitude behind it and what they were using and not using it for. Secondly, the perilous times are not just in the future for the rich, they're for today. Again, and even in James's day and our day, wrong to envy the rich. A book by Paul Watchell entitled "The Poverty of Affluence" revealed that there was a higher percentage of people that had a grammar school education, had poverty level incomes. A higher level of those said they experienced a very satisfied life. There was the lowest percentage among those who had college educations and high incomes. It doesn't help. It doesn't help. There's nothing wrong with having a high income and a college education, but that alone is not going to help you. James is saying there is a future judgment, and it's pretty radical. And we'll look at the indictment and the evidence against these particular men. But even right now, there's an illusion out there that says if we had more. Do you watch those commercials and, he just won $5,000 a week for the rest of his life? I don't know if you're tempted to go, what would I do with that? There's just, you think, I wouldn't be like these idiots, of course, and we've read, about the people that win the Powerball for $150 million and their lives are ruined, within a few years. And we think, yeah, but that wouldn't be me, because I'm like, actually, it's kind of a problem for everybody. Warren Buffett, who I mentioned before, one of the wealthiest men in the world, has a doctrine that's referred to as the jerk doctrine. And the jerk doctrine, according to this article that I read, says that Buffett has said, of the billionaires, not millionaires, but of the billionaires I have known, money just brings out the basic traits in them. If they were jerks before they had money, they are simply jerks with $1 billion. It doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't help you at all. Paul says this in 1 Timothy 6:9, but those who, here's the problem, desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many, many sorrows. So Paul gives steps in a downward spiral, and the problem here is the attitude behind money. It's the desire to get rich. It wouldn't take you long in interviewing your friends and family members to say, are you interested in being rich? I think you'd probably get a few, yes, certainly I am, out of them. I think that's why advertising is so successful for why you should buy this precious metal now, or whatever it might be. Guard yourself against the coming inflation. It's a popular theme, the desire to be rich. Paul says in verse 9, they fall into a temptation. Now we're to pray, and Lord, lead us not into temptation. But Paul says, if you have this attitude, you will fall into temptation. It's referred to as the devil's trap. Paul makes reference to this in his letter to Timothy in chapter 3, verse 6, as far as elders in the church. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. Well, we could talk a lot about what the devil's trap is, and certainly one of the issues is pride, but one of it is materialism. And that's a problem. We fall into temptation if we desire or live our lives to be rich. Secondly, Paul says they fall into many foolish and harmful desires. And certainly greed is desire that breeds other negative desires with it. Greed never leads to other good characteristics. It only leads to other bad ones. And he calls those desires actually foolish. What does he mean by foolish? It means they cannot be rationally defended. Those desires and what you have, what you want to have, and why you want to have it cannot be rationally defended. One person said, gold has been said to be like seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. And then, again, this term is not an emotional term. It's not like someone saying, oh, I'd like to be rich. Many of us may have said that. But it's talking about goals and motivation for living. And if your goal and your motivation for living are the same thing, then you're in trouble. If my goal is to have $100,000 in the bank, liquid, by the end of the year. And my motivation for having it is because I want to have $100,000 in the bank by the end of the year. I'm in trouble. If my goal and my motivation are the same things, I'm in trouble. If my goal is to have $100,000 in the bank by the end of the year, and my motivation for doing that is because I can build several orphanages all across India with $100,000, I'm okay. Because my goal and my motivation are not the same thing. And that's what Paul talks about in terms of falling into the devil's trap. Again, if your goal and motivation are the same, it's a troubling situation. And Paul says these wrong desires plunge men into ruin, in destruction. Again, notice verse 10, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So money itself is neutral. It's neutral. It's not one thing or another. It's just completely neutral. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just neutral. It's the love of money that's the problem. Secondly, notice that it's not only the evil, it's a kind of evil, the kind of evil that brings mankind into ruin and destruction. And thirdly, most importantly perhaps, it's a root. It's the root that affects everything in your life. The love of money doesn't lead you into a particular sin. It doesn't distort your character in a particular way. It's the root. He describes it, again, like a tree. The tree has roots. It comes up through the trunk. What it brings in is going to affect the whole system. If you destroy the root system, the tree is coming down. If the root system is healthy, the tree is going to be healthy. It's at the very basis of who you are and how you think and how you perceive not only yourself but others. The love of money is the root of not just one evil, but all kinds of evil that comes out of it. So again, in the end, we're going to put our 1 Timothy passage and James's passage together, and I think help us get a better application out of James's text here. Is Paul saying, therefore, we should all be poor and happy? No, but he's saying that riches is not the problem. The problem is a life lived with the priority of being rich. The third thing about this perilous future for these rich that are described by James, notice the command. He commands them to weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. And that's because they will be judged in the future. And according to verse 9, as we'll see later, that judgment will come from Jesus Christ, who is a righteous judge, who will always do the right thing. Nobody will have a good enough lawyer. Nobody will get off on a technicality because there'll be 3 indictments or points of evidence brought against them. We might say that Jesus is the prosecuting attorney as well as the judge. And the first piece of evidence he will call is the rich men's wealth, which will witness against them. Now, again, it's interesting that they've saved these things and acquired them over their lives, believing that it's going to be a really good thing. They're going to get at the end of their life, they're going to face Jesus Christ, and all of those riches that they have accumulated will be evidence, number one, against them, because they have it and did nothing with it in terms of helping others. And notice what happens to it. It rots away in terms of the grain. He makes reference to the gold and silver rusting. Gold and silver, of course, don't rust. He's just taking a term from the poetic language of the Old Testament and the wisdom literature so that we understand it has no lasting value. None of these things have any lasting value at all. And again, the irony here is the things that they saved, they thought was so important, would be evidence, number one, against them in terms of a judgment. Secondly, the wages they held back will also witness against them in court, and that's in verse 4 as well. People have come to work for them. They were promised a certain wage, and then it was held back, even when they had it to pay. Stolen salaries will cry out against them. That'll be the second witness. And then thirdly, the workers themselves will also testify against them. That's in verse 4. So again, the focus here, a specific type of rich person. They gain wealth in an illegal, ungodly way. They make it the center of their lives and they fail to use it in order to benefit others. And are there people out there like this today? Yeah, absolutely. I pray you don't work for any of them, but it's difficult. I can tell you who does. Immigrant farm workers. That's who does. If you see what they make and what they earn, it would blow your mind. And where my family's from in Napa, we watch them come in terms of the vineyards and everything, and they kind of live in the neighborhoods and around where my sister lives. And boy, if you talk to them and see what they make and how hard they work, it would be shocking. It would be shocking to you. This is not just something that was a problem in the ancient world, and certainly is not confined to just our own country, our own culture. It happens around the world. But again, in the context of the big picture, again in verse 4 of chapter 4, where we began this theme, as I mentioned before, James says, "Do you not know that friendship with the world, this world system, the way it thinks, is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." I don't think any of us want to be an enemy of God. I mentioned Jesus' words here earlier in Matthew 6:24, echoing the same things of James. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon or money." You can't do both, Jesus says. Your hearts will be given to one or given to the other. Can you successfully, as a believer in Jesus Christ, live your entire life for the sake of riches? James says you can't really do that. Jesus says you can't do it. And Paul says even if you're a believer and you attempt to do it, it will lead you down a path that you do not want to go to. There's an old hymn that says, "Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to the cross I cling." Well, it's hard to get to that cross if your hand is full of stuff. That's the idea. And we've already covered a section earlier in the epistle where James says that we need to really be praying for the rich of this world because they are so spiritually disadvantaged. So spiritually disadvantaged. And we kind of wondered if any of you would take a drive through Kahala the next week and begin to pray for those poor people living in those mansions that are so disadvantaged. But literally, that's what James is saying. There's a tremendous disadvantage. They just don't have the same needs. When their child is ill, they can get the very best doctor. Sometimes you just got to pray. Your dependence on God is completely different. When you lose your job and you don't have one coming, your brother doesn't own one of the local corporations that will immediately give you a job. You just kind of have to pray for it and really trust the Lord. It's just a different way to live, and it's a different way to think. I don't think normally we think of the rich as being tremendously disadvantaged, but they are in terms of eternity, in terms of the spiritual realm. There are perilous times ahead for the rich. Secondly, personal wealth does not last. Kind of already alluded to that a little bit, but notice again in verse 2, "Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire." Again, James is not the guy that pulls a lot of punches. That's why we referred to him tongue-in-cheek as the in-your-face prophet. In the ancient world, personal wealth was measured in three ways. Harvested grain. Today it's whatever you got in the bank, your savings, your stock portfolio, how much real estate you may own, or and so forth. But in the ancient world, it was harvested grain. It was the amount of grain that your fields had produced in that year. It was the clothes that you wore. Now that hasn't changed a lot. I read this week in some research to this subject, an article about a pair of jeans, and it talked about them and their wholesale and what they were. They retail for $353 for a pair of jeans. I don't have those. I think I would feel ill wearing a pair of jeans that cost that much. But clothes, it hasn't really changed. So the clothing was an important thing. In the ancient world, you could look at someone, tell by the fabric, where it was from, how they dressed, how much money they had. And then precious metals and jewels, that part hasn't had changed a lot. But James's whole point, even these riches are uncertain. And there's nothing worse than spending money to buy nice clothes and then and realize that they shrink. I don't know if you had that problem. The first time I went to Hong Kong, I was with Mike Stengel, and he says, "Do you have a suit?" I go, "No, I don't have a suit." And he goes, "Oh, we got to get you a suit while you're here." And well, we're only here one night. He goes, you don't need very long. So he takes me to a place, and you go around, and the people are out this much, and you're going back and forth. Anyway, I'm going to get a custom-made suit for $190, a beautiful fabric. I go in and get measured for it. At 5 o'clock, we go eat. We come back at 7, and I get fitted. It's already kind of roughed out and everything. Come back at 10 o'clock that night to pick it up in the garment bag. Now, I think the garment bag was the problem, because I wore that suit, beautiful fabric. I wore that suit 2, 3, 4 times at the most. And then I took it out of that garment bag. The thing had just shrunk down to nothing. I couldn't get the pants on. I could hardly get the jacket on. I warn against garment bags, but we think that these things are going to last, and they are uncertain. The stock market fluctuates from hour to hour, and again, our gold doesn't rust away, but it certainly climbs and drops in value. It doesn't last. Secondly, personal wealth has, again, no lasting value, and that's what Jesus has said all along. Again, another reference to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, verse 19. Jesus there says, he warns us against this, but yet we do it all the time. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And again, that's where James is really getting all of this, and that's the problem. Where our treasure is, that's where our heart is going to be also. God entrusts all of us with what we sometimes call the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. We've all got some degree of all of them, and it's a matter of, do we store up treasures in heaven or here on earth? We can either invest those 3 things in the kingdom of God, or we can invest in things that are here on earth, but personal wealth does not last. And then thirdly, the practices that deserve a judgment. And again, these are being relegated to a particular group of rich that James very much qualifies. But he says, again in verse 3, the second half, you have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fatted your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. So 4 practices that are pointed out by James here. The first one is hoarding. Verse 3, the second half, you have heaped up treasure in the last days. That is, you just keep it and keep it and keep it growing. The idea of hoarding. Again, I read a story about a woman named Bertha Adams, 71 years old, from West Palm Beach, Florida. On Easter Sunday, 1976, her body was discovered in her home, and the cause of death was determined to be malnutrition. She had wasted away to 50 pounds, and she could no longer stay alive. Now, the guys that went into her home said they'd never seen anything like it. She had so much stuff jammed in the house. And even there's sometimes we read about fires here locally, house fires, and Eddie can tell you about it. The worst thing is if it's a hoarder, somebody you get in there and you cannot get in and through the house because it's all full of stuff. That's the way this woman's home was. But they found 2 keys to safety deposit boxes. And one of the boxes was 700 AT&T stock certificates, hundreds of other valuable stock certificates, and $200,000 cash. In the other safe deposit box, she had $600,000 cash, way over $1 million of it. She dies because she's been begging food and clothing from her neighbors. She just hoarded it, and it didn't do any good. Again, that's an example of what James is talking about. That's an evidence against him. This is what greed and living for riches lead to. It's this idea of never having enough, never being satisfied at all. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:14, for the children ought not to lay up for their parents, but the parents for their children. In other words, you've got something. It's meant to bless other people, to help others. Again, laying up treasures in heaven or here on earth. The second practice is that of fraud. That's in verse 4. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. So the guys are out there working, and again, in that day, they went out and worked, and then they were paid their wages that day. That way they could go to the market to buy what they needed for dinner that night. I don't know if you've ever had to live in that kind of a situation. I actually did it one time. And I remember going down at 5 o'clock in the morning to this office in Waikiki where you could get a day job, and it would pay cash. And I was amazed at how many people were down there at 5 o'clock in the morning hoping to get sent out on a day. One of these lovely jobs like setting up the rides at E.K. Fernandez or something like that. And you do it for the day, you get paid that day, and that meant you could buy food you could eat that night. That's what these guys are doing here. And what they're doing is then they have the money, they're hoarding the money, and they're not paying their workers. These are Jewish businessmen living in Jerusalem. And this is completely against the law. I mean, they can seem religious, but Moses writes in Deuteronomy 24:14, you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin to you, which of course it was. They were sinning every day that they did it. And it was radical, because it was the only means of these group of people being able to eat. The word there, the verb keep back in the original Greek, indicates that they'll never get their salaries. In other words, this is an ongoing thing. It's not like, kind of missed them on Wednesday there, we'll kind of make up for it on Thursday. No, it was a practice of this group of people. And of course, it's a concern today, as I mentioned. We'll be seeing some Dickens novel very put to stage or movie very soon about such a person, and Tiny Tim, who can never get that surgery, and that he needs, and so forth, because of this kind of sin. And as I mentioned, it happens all the time. It happened to an individual at one time that went on to become a fairly well-known painter. He was treated in such a way by people who claimed to be Christians, and he actually left the ministry where he was an evangelist and took up painting. His name was Vincent van Gogh, but he started out as an evangelist. But he saw this kind of sin happening by people that said he was believers, and it actually turned him from the faith completely. James says there's two cries that go up. There's the cries that these landowners should be concerned about, the unpaid wages and what they're holding in their bank accounts. The other cry is from the workers themselves. Notice it reaches the ears of the Lord. Again, in our New King James, it's Sabaoth. Other translations, it's the Lord Almighty, which means the Lord of hosts. That's an important term that he's using here. It means the angelic armies of heaven. It's the term that David used when he was kind of out there trash talking with Goliath. In 1 Samuel 7:14, verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you have come to me with sword and spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you, which of course David did that very thing. So this is quite an important term that James is using here. I just don't know if he could use heavier language or not in trying to address this problem. Again, prophetic cry against any person or nation that treats their citizens and their peoples in this way. Remember, when the Lord comes back to planet Earth, one of the things he's going to do, Matthew 24 talks about the description of those events leading up to it, leads into Matthew 25, what we call the Olivet Discourse. One of the things that happens there is there's a judgment against nations. Now, the judgments are primarily going to be, are nations during that end time period Semitic? Are they pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, or are they anti-Semitic? And they're going to be judged based on that basis. But also, I believe this judgment will come into play as well. How did nations treat the poor of their country? The term cry is a loud scream. And again, this is certainly a message to Christian employers that you better make sure you're paying your workers a fair wage. I would say more than a fair wage if you want God's blessing and not his judgment. Because the tendency is to fall into the pattern of this world and squeeze every dime that you can get out of people. And James says, look at this example. You don't want to go there. Thirdly, the other practice here is self-indulgent. That's in verse 5. You live on earth in pleasure and luxury. And again, the accumulation of wealth brings an addiction. I don't think that's too strong of a term. It brings an addiction to self-indulgence. And we sometimes like watching those shows of the rich and the famous, and we're kind of amazed, at the air-conditioned dog houses and the gold-plated, faucets and so forth. It's very, very, very interesting. When I was doing stained glass work, I went into some pretty affluent homes. I remember doing some repair work for the original Henry Kaiser home that's on the beach there in Hawaii Kai. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of fun to cruise around and see these places. There's an addiction towards self-indulgence. There's never enough. The fourth practice James mentions is the legal power to murder. That's in verse 6. You've condemned, you've murdered the just. He does not resist you. Someone said what the golden rule is, he who has the gold rules. And certainly that was true in James's day. He's talking about a judicial way to murder someone. In other words, these guys had the ability to take anybody they wanted to court, and their workers are never going to win. They can deny their ability to earn a living if they wanted to and needed to. They had all of the power. In a sense, they were murdering them by the way that they were treating them in terms of the labor market and so forth. And again, lots of warnings in the Old Testament about not doing this, making sure there's a just system of courts. There's a warning in Exodus of judges to not be greedy. There's a warning in Leviticus, again, about the poor, how they should be treated by the rich and so forth. Perjury is condemned. Bribery is condemned. All of the things that corrupt our court system today. And it's not a lot different. I mean, if you get dragged into court today, hope it's by not somebody that's really rich or a pretty well-off corporation, because they can drag you along for years. And there's just, if you don't have money, there's just not a lot you can do about it. It's a terrible predicament that we find ourselves in. One of the last really big stained glass commissions that I did was over on Maui, and it was fairly large. I built a window that was 16 feet by 22 feet 4 times. So there were 4 of those. It took us a year to work out the contract for it, just the financial arrangements. Fortunately, I was working for the gal that designed it, who worked in just did a lot of big-time commissions. So she already had her private attorney. So we had to have a private attorney to draw up the contract to even do the job. And she explained to me the reason we have to do this is because we've got to make sure that we have enough of our money when the installation is done, that if we walk away and they never pay us another dime, we're okay. Because it happens all the time in the construction industry. So we'll have this thing so that we stage the payments so that when we walk away, when you're done installing, if we never get another dime out of these guys, are you okay? Are you going to be okay with that financially? And I said, yeah, I'll still be okay. Sure, it'd be nice to have that last. That's what you call your profit. But yeah, it's just that the world that we live in, because these guys know that it's not worth it for you to drag something out in court for the next 10 years. That was the concern here. It's judicial murder that these guys were bringing to the people, their brethren, all around him, and quite an indictment here. Now, again, how should we live? And I wanted to bring back, again, these two duties that Paul gives us to believers, and then the indictment here, which I think we've said enough, is against unbelievers. Again, 1 Timothy 6:17, Paul has a lot to say in the concern about those who are rich. Let me read this to you again. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, not to be proud. Here's the instructions. If you're a believer, you've got some means, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God. Don't trust in your stuff, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may take hold of eternal life. So here's the instructions, and you may not consider yourself rich or wealthy, but again, compared to most of the people around the planet today, you probably would fall into that category. So two duties. The rich are to do good and be rich in good deeds. Why? Because we represent God, and God is generous, and God is good. And so we should be as well. The rich can lay up treasures in heaven. And of course, those treasures are spiritual. In doing so, Paul says we'll take a hold of life that is truly life. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. That's very hard to convince your kids of that fact. But there's a place in time where hopefully we all realize that it truly is more blessed to give than to receive. So when we put these two passages together, our James passage, the 1 Timothy passage, we could say the following. It is possible to be poor in this world, according to James 2:5, and yet be rich in the next world. Isn't that true? I mean, there's going to be a lot of poor people that are going to be really rich in heaven. I've met them in India and China and other places around the world, and I've been in the slums in India and see people. As I sit down a dirt floor on a wooden bench to hear the testimony of a woman that was God miraculously healed, and what has happened as a result in terms of people coming to faith in the middle of that area. This is Mumbai. If you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, it opens in that slum. That was the slums that I was in. I'm talking open trenches of sewer, animals running everywhere. It's kind of the whole vision of what you consider a third world. And they're running around trying to buy me a Coca-Cola so that I have because I'm their honored guest. I don't even want to think about how much that costs them. And I'm told I better drink it and say thank you, or it's going to be a great insult. It's amazing when you think you have nothing, still how generous you can be. And Paul's saying you can be very poor materially in this life and be very rich in the next, according to James 2:5. According to Paul in 1 Timothy 6:17, it's possible to be rich in this world and poor in the next. You can be rich in this world and be poor in the next world. Therefore, the return of Jesus Christ will make some poor people and others rich, depending upon the spiritual condition of their hearts. When Jesus Christ returns, which is the subject that he gets into next week, and he comes back, okay, now as believers, you got to realize all of this is going around. You may be the victim of it sometimes, so how do you live? He says we got to persevere. We got to see that the Lord is coming, and that'll be our subject next time. But again, The return of Jesus Christ will make some people poor and others rich, depending upon the spiritual condition of their hearts. And just kind of want to close with a little quote from an individual that's in the hospital. And I'll read his quote, but I can tell you I've heard it quite a few times myself. Very few people, when they're in that hospital bed and they think that their life is ebbing away. I can tell you the believers, they all say the same thing basically. They might phrase it differently, but they all have two regrets. They always regret they had not spent more time with their family, and they hadn't done more for the Lord and the work of the Lord in this life. That absolutely, that's what they all say. Whether they've got 2 weeks, a week, or 2 hours left, and we just happen to be there with them. That's always the two regrets. This individual writes, I came to realize in this hospital bed, I came to realize I no longer cared for what the world chases after, such as how much money they make or how much money you have in the bank, how many cars are parked in the garage. As it says in Ecclesiastes, chasing after these things is like chasing the wind. Anyway, suddenly the rat race became vanity to me, utter vanity. I felt naked before God. If I died, I would take none of the stuff with me. All that really mattered ultimately was my relationship with the Lord, my relationship with family and friends. If it weren't for the loss of my health, I could have wasted the rest of my life chasing achievements and acquiring more transitory things. So he was thanking God for the terrible illness he had in the hospital, because it gave him a different perspective on life. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Just got to think about what we really treasure in this life. Again, how does this fit with the previous passage? Life is but a vapor. Right? That was the brevity of life. That's what James had just said. God opposes the proud. He gives grace to the humble. How do we know if we're humble? Well, are you speaking evil against your neighbor? He goes through a whole list of things, and you can just read right through it. It's like, oh, I'm in bad shape here. Or I'm okay, because I want to be that recipient of God's grace. I want to realize how short this life really is. And I want to live it with the purposes that God has in mind. Amen. Wow, let's go.